Harrison's Reality Check, sponsored in part by
Exergen. Now there's a new way to check for coronavirus symptoms at home with Exergen. Just like hospitals and medical professionals, simply hold it up to your forehead and know your status right away. Exergen. Make sure all your friends have one.
Harrison's Reality Check.
It's time, once and for all, to talk to probably the most celebrated, and I mean this, intellectualoid who's been able to figure out, so that you and I can understand it in a very clear way, how the Second Amendment works. Everything is about the Second Amendment. Everything. Forget the other amendments. There's only the Second Amendment. Damn it.
Goodness gracious.
But what does it really mean? Well, the Second Amendment says that I get to have my own personal cache of handguns, explosives, and nuclear bombs to use at will because the Constitution says so. Apparently it doesn't.
Yes, the phrase "the people," people with a capital P, was used in a very specific manner in the late 18th century, specifically by the group of men we call the Founders. And one of the points I make, I think, earlier in the essay is that is very pertinent to understanding not just the Second Amendment. It was actually the fourth. They eliminated the first two, so it got shifted down to it became the second amendment to the Constitution a couple years after the main body had been written in the late 80s, 1780s. But all of the discourse that was conducted at the time, be it the Federalist Papers, the Constitution itself, the Declaration of Independence, the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the King of England, used locutions in a very particular manner, including the people with a capital P. And it's interesting to delve into the context of that particular locution to see how we in the modern age should be thinking about that, because, of course, the meaning of words changes over time.
Let me just set the stage here, because I love exactly where you're going. So there is the people, meaning all of us, meaning the state, and then there's individuals. So now you're going to talk about the difference between the two so that we can understand what the Second Amendment was actually saying.
Right. So the people with a capital P basically referred, generally speaking, to the polity, the citizenry of the country, who in a democracy ideally are equated with the state. The state is a function of the will of the people. The people, you can call it the polity, the citizenry. The ancient Greeks called it the demos. It's basically the body of people who were civilians that had a say in the governing process of their society. So the people is kind of a collective term. And the reason why it's kind of a relevant point for the Second Amendment is that if you survey the amendments, there is a distinction between individual rights and more collective rights. And when there were individual rights in question, for example, in the First Amendment with freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience and religion, it pertained to the individual. And then there were other instances where it was pertaining to the demos, the polity, as a collective conception of rights as it applied to the people in general. And that ends up being pertinent when it comes to understanding how the phrasing came to be as it now is in the Second Amendment. So you've got individual rights and collective rights is one distinction that I try to make sense out of, and show that when the individual right was up for in question, they used one phrasing, and when collective rights were in question, they tended to use a different phrasing, the people. The other key distinction I make is the inalienable right versus the what might be called the contingency-based right or the provisional right. There are certain rights that were provisional, not inalienable or inviolable, that were not inherent in every human being. And the Second Amendment.
You have good examples in there, too. You talked about how basically the Second Amendment was militias to defend the state, not to defend Timmy defending Mildred or Timmy defending Timmy. It was Timmy in service of defending the state because there was no national military. George Washington came up with some ideas on that one later on. And that if you were a clodhopper and, missing more than one eye, you weren't allowed to run around with loaded guns and shoot at anything that moved. So it really was a function of protecting the state to a certain degree.
Right. It was not an inalienable right. It was clearly intended to be a contingent right or a provisional right that had a very particular context, a certain purpose that made perfect sense at the time, given the circumstances under which it was written, which we can get into. But insofar as one was serving in the capacity as a militiaman, serving the state at the state's pleasure, it was seen as required that white men, preferably white landowning men, had the right to keep and bear what essentially amounted to muskets, powder-loaded muskets with bayonets oftentimes. If they didn't have their own bayonets, they were provided by the state. So insofar as a white landowning man served in that capacity, he was told that this right must exist, because were it not to exist, the civilian militia on which the security of the state depended would be ill-equipped to perform that vital service. And just to finish the point, the reason that it was a civilian militia that was vital to the security of a free state was because it was in lieu of the alternative, which was a professional military, what was called a standing army. And the reason why the founders did not want a standing army, which is what we now have, by the way, it's called the Department of Defense. Back then, the founders were concerned, and for very good reason, that a government that had a standing army was setting the stage for a tyrant to be able to easily take over, because he would have a professional military at his disposal. And they were terrified at that prospect, and were very clear about that in their writings. And so in lieu of being able to have a standing army, they needed something that would serve the critical purpose of protecting the state in the absence of that. And the alternative, of course, was being able to mobilize civilian men, white civilian men, to serve the state when the state required, for putting down internal insurrections, for preventing incursions from other military powers, other nation states. And there was a specific event that actually prompted this and illustrated why this was a concern, and that was Shays Rebellion. I think Shays Rebellion, I wrote it down here. I go into the 1787, I think it was in Massachusetts. A gentleman named Shays mobilized a rebellion. This is prior to the Constitution. It was an event that occurred when Washington was still the general of the armies. And it was a learning experience. It was a reminder that something needed to be in place, i.e. a civilian militia, a well-regulated civilian militia, to handle events like Shays Rebellion. After the Second Amendment.
Let's jump into that, Mason Scott, because not everyone is going to be familiar with a lot of these historical references here. Let's say what Shays Rebellion was, so that people can understand. Oh, I think I remember that from 8th grade.
Well, the details, off the top of my head, I think it occurred in Western Massachusetts, possibly near Springfield. But basically, Shays was a man who, wanted to kind of stage a uprising against the government, with which he was displeased. He mobilized, kind of a group of people to rise up. And I think they stormed an armory, if I'm not mistaken. They tried to overtake some kind of government installation, and Washington, of course, needed to put down this rebellion. And the only way he found he was able to do it was by mobilizing a civilian militia. And of course, this was during the Articles of the Confederation. So there wasn't a centralized, well-oiled machine in place to carry out this quick, spur of the moment mobilization to put down the insurrection. So resurrection, I almost said.
Well, it became a resurrection.
So the insurrection.
2021, didn't we?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of resurrections as well, but
yeah.
But after the amendment was written, it was actually instantly invoked again a couple years later with the Whiskey Rebellion. And this is after Washington, by then was president. And there was something called the Whiskey Rebellion. I think it might have been in Pennsylvania. That was in 94. But the Whiskey Rebellion, occurred. It was another, not resurrection, but insurrection. And the Second Amendment was explicitly invoked in conjunction with a act called the Militia Act. I think they just called it the Militia Act. The fact that they called it the Militia Act is very telling, because it was about the civilian militia that was being used per the Second Amendment. So basically, the long and short of it is the Second Amendment was saying, if we're going to have a civilian militia in lieu of a professional standing army, these civilians need to be sufficiently equipped to carry out this charge in the event that they need to be called to duty to serve the state and protect the state. And in order for that to be the case, they need to have muskets. They need to be armed, or else it wouldn't work. And so that was very, very important at the time. And again, that was the Fourth Amendment. They ended up not passing the first two amendments that were proposed for the Bill of Rights. So the third became the first, the fourth became the second. So we now know it is the Second Amendment, not the fourth. And if you go to the museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian, and you look at the original paper that's behind the glass there, you'll see that the right to bear arms is number 4. Because
imagine this is your money and someone wants to take it from you. Who is it? The IRS. Guess what? They want your money and they can take it, all of it if they want. Remember, they sent you that letter right over here that said, hey, you owe us a bunch of cash and we're going to take it from you right now. So what do? You fight back by letting our team of experts work it out with the IRS so you can keep your money. And hey, we're good at what we do. When you hire us, you get a team of guys on your side that know the IRS laws, and we'll fight really hard to save your money. So if you owe the IRS a ton of cash and you want to keep it, call right now and learn for free how we can help you put it back in your pocket. 5 minutes of your time right now can save you thousands of dollars. And the best part, it's a free call. So please call right now.
The obsolescence of the Second Amendment, which is a kind of provocative title. But the upshot of this whole thing is that pursuant to the establishment of the War Department, what we now call the Department of Defense, euphemistically, I would say, because it's more of the Department of Offense.
Well, yeah, it was the War Department.
We have a professional army. And so
World War II, exactly. And then it evolved into something lovelier sounding.
Well, it didn't all happen World War II, but World War II was, shall we say, the final nail in the coffin of making it obsolete. It actually had been becoming obsolete since the Civil War. There was a steady metamorphosis of how the federal government mobilized troops to handle any kind of military operation. And it underwent a metamorphosis over the course of, between, say, the Civil War, when the Union had to mobilize an army, and World War II, when the War Department was established and they built the Pentagon. So it's an interesting history. A lot of things happened in that intervening time. The establishment of the National Guard, for example, which is kind of a de facto civilian militia that serves the government on the state level. And so I kind of devote most of the essay to the history, the citations, the statements that were made by the people that drafted it, why they phrased it in the way that they did. And it's, I guess, incontrovertible that the amendment is now just categorically obsolete. It no longer applies. Now, I'm careful to say that a right to have a lethal firearm today can be totally granted. The argument can be made that certain people under certain circumstances should be allowed to arm themselves with firearms. But the catch is the argument can't have anything to do with the Second Amendment because it is no longer relevant. So that right would have to be based on a different argument. It would have to be based on another justification for being able to keep and bear arms, quote unquote, that has no relation whatsoever to what we call the Second Amendment.
Well, clearly people are doing backflips right now all over the place because that's not their understanding. And they don't really have an understanding except maybe what the TV set says they ought to understand. So let's talk for a minute because language is everything. It's literally everything. It tells you about what was happening at the time. It tells you about what was the intent. And it tells you what did they actually mean and what things actually do mean. So in the Second Amendment, in your article here, The Obsolescence of the Second Amendment, we can go to masonscott.org to read more. Cary Harrison with you. We are talking to Mason Scott, his nom de plume. And in there, we looked at the word well-regulated militia. Now, it can mean two things. At the time, regulation meant two things. One, it meant to limit, but it also meant to supply. So well-regulated militia meant a well-supplied militia. As you point out, if they didn't have the bayonets, they were furnished them. But it also meant regulated, meaning that the weapons then had to be stored in an armory. You didn't necessarily take home your bayonets and everything else and just throw them up on the wall and have at it on demand. It was actually kept in an organized fashion so that you didn't end up with Michigan militias and, Florida militias and West Hollywood militias, which are Shays Rebellion flavored things popping up here and there. It was well regulated.
Right. Yeah. It's one of the important points is the legitimate fear that the founders had, and they were very explicit about this, and they wrote about it. I cite all the relevant statements in the piece, but they were very concerned, and rightfully so, about anything other than non-professional civilians having arms. Because the moment there started to be armories and professionally trained regiments that were kind of mobilized directly for that explicit purpose, that was their vocation. They were specialized. It was a specialized force. The worry at the time was this would jeopardize the democracy because tyrants tended to make use of such things, and they were terrified of that. Again, understandably so. And so it's very important to understand why they did not want to have a standing army, but in the absence of having a standing army, it was critical that they had some other means by which they could mobilize, armed soldiers when the occasion arose that they needed a resource like that, to fend off attacks from other countries or to put down, whether it was the Whiskey Rebellion or Shays Rebellion or any other rebellion. Now, the other very disturbing part of this, of course, is that there were specific reasons that they wanted white landowning men to be armed. And that was to put down slave uprisings, which was a huge concern in the South, and also to be well equipped to battle the Native Americans as the frontier pushed westward. That was an ongoing issue. And in those early years, the frontier wasn't moving quite yet, but as the decades went by, it became more and more of an issue. And as the 1800s progressed, of course, there was more and more of a federalized force that started to be formed to take care of the Native American issue during the hegemonic campaign that was very violent, very militarized. But it was like I said, it was a steady metamorphosis over time. There wasn't like one day where suddenly there was a standing army when the previous day there hadn't been a standing army. It was kind of a very slow process over the course of really over a century, up until the Civil War. But the Second Amendment, they were very clear that they had in mind being able to put down slave uprisings, slave revolts, keep slaves in line in the South specifically, of course, to be able to take care of the quote unquote Indian problem when that came up as the decades went on and the settlers the colonialists moved westward. And also, there was no professional police force at the time. We're talking in the late 1800s again, the first, decade or two of the Republic. There were no professional police departments. So, there were local sheriff's departments, and they deputized certain men that they were kind of, in cahoots with in their municipality to, serve as a kind of a de facto, what we would call a police force for certain locations, certain areas. But it was very ad hoc. I mean, this everything kind of evolved over time. But at the time that the Second Amendment was written, there was no professional police force. There was no professional army. There were concerns about slave rebellions and attacks from Native Americans. All these things were going on, and they were very pressing concerns. And naturally, in lieu of a standing army, there needed to be some kind of mobilization mechanism in place. So I kind of get into that a little bit. And of course, here we are in the 21st century where all of these circumstances no longer exist. So the very valid concerns at the time
were white men who seem to be the predominant owners of the weapons and still believe that they're the ones that ought to have them. Interestingly enough, just because you're white and a landowner does not mean you have some special relationship with a gun.
Well,
am I right? I mean,
right.
it's like, oh, well, there's a quality marksman there for you. He's got a plot of land and he's white, an excellent marksman. Not the case. And they saw that over and over again, didn't they?
Well, a little bit. Yeah. I mean, obviously, what I'm describing, as their, concerns at the time are reprehensible, morally speaking, now that we understand the, how despicable the, setup was at that point. We being white landowning men were enslaving, people that had been shipped over from Africa. That was, happening. So the racism involved is kind of baked into the Second Amendment, also with, Native Americans who were seen as kind of less than human as well. So the racism, of course, isn't explicit in the amendment, but the amendment was written during a time and under circumstances that were horrifyingly, morally speaking, odious to how we now understand civil society to be. And we should be rightfully disturbed by that. But it's important to understand the circumstances under which the statement was written. And if one doesn't understand the circumstances under which it was written and why it was written and why the purpose at the time made sense to those who were composing it, then you completely miss the point of why that amendment even exists. And I feel like that seems to be lost on a lot of people now.
Let's cut to the chase here, which is fascinating as we distill your thesis into the core proposition, the obsolescence of the Second Amendment. Now that is going to make people froth and foam. The NRA certainly doesn't think it's obsolete. But the fact is, the point of the Second Amendment, as you point out, with all your footnotes and excellent research and incredible deep digs into history, the founding fathers, all of it is there at masonscott.org. And it's a must read. And it's a must read not in a fat tome that's going to take you a year to read, but it's like 38 pages.
Yeah, if you download the PDF, I think it's about 30 pages.
Yeah, it's quick. It's quick and it's all there. And
for those who are interested, it's I think it's under 30 pages. That includes the appendix and the endnotes, etc. I do spend some time. It's 37 and a half pages with the appendix and the endnotes. I do address why. Let
me just say here. I'm a white man. Let me just say here. Hey, fella. One of the things that's important to note for the obsolescence is that in the time there was no standing army. The state had no way to protect or defend itself, so it looked upon the citizens to do that. Now we're the largest military on the planet with over 900 operating military bases scattered all over the planet. If any other country had 900 bases, we would be a little pissed off, especially if those bases were on our soil. We are on everyone else's soil. We have satellites. We have surveillance where we can count the hair follicles on your arm. There are no secrets anywhere. We are so overly saturated with every possible permutation, military presence, and stance since the dawn of humankind. The Romans would have gotten a hard on, even at the fantasy of having a tenth of what we have. Alexander the Great would have said, that sounds pretty good to me. So when looking at the Second Amendment, you're right. It's like, here's your musket, fella, and your bayonet. Put it in there, lock the door, go home, don't get too drunk.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And it's good to keep in mind that the white men who owned land that qualified, who the authors had in mind for this, forfeited their right to have a gun if they were misbehaved, if they were deemed inept to carry out their duty as a militiaman. They forfeited that right. So it was indeed a provisional right, and a provisional right that was granted for a very specific purpose that made perfect sense at the time. Just to broach the other part of the essay where I then talk about, so why then is there all this Second Amendment mania now? And I come at it at two different angles. The first angle is money. The NRA, of course, but there are other organizations, masquerade as civil rights organizations, but they're nothing of the sort. All they are business lobbies. They only exist, the NRA really since the late 70s when it underwent a transformation, because it used to be just a outdoorsman kind of guild. But it now is just a business lobby for gun manufacturers, gun retailers, ammunition manufacturers.
The single largest structure in Washington, D.C. is the NRA's office building.
And it's now bankrupt. because unsurprisingly, it was horrifically corrupt.
Well,
but
so they just
it's important. It's
rebrand. But
yeah,
yes,
it's important to understand though that the NRA does not care about public safety or anyone's rights or freedom or personal liberties or anything like that. It is a business lobby. It exists only to generate demand for guns, ammo, and basically gunpowder, which goes in the bullets, which is also a big booming industry. It's ultimately just about money. The other angle that I come at this with well, why do so many people so frequently, routinely misread the Second Amendment? What's the motive? I put forth this theory about insecurity, and the insecurity can take the form of just general social insecurity. People don't feel safe. It's a very intimidating world we live in, and some people feel safer if they're armed. I also think there's an element of male insecurity that is a significant explanation for why people basically fetishize guns in the United States, unlike any other place on the planet Earth at any point in history. It's a very bizarre phenomenon that we have in the US, where we basically have a pandemic of gun fetishism. And it exists, I think, for some reasons that are not too difficult to unravel. There's, insecurity, with respect to masculinity, what it is to be a real man, a real patriot. A lot of men who are insecure about themselves want to be a tough guy. They want to be the star of their own movie. Because of course we watch a lot of movies, TV, where the dashing protagonist, the heroic gun-toting, swashbuckling hero of the movie or of the TV show is toting a gun, and he vanquishes the villains in the story. And I think a lot of specifically men kind of like to fashion themselves as that guy. And this allows them to have that outlet, because guns are always involved with in action movies with the hero of the story. And we all like to be the heroes of our own story. And we kind of cast ourselves in our own movie, action movie, in some cases. And I think that explains a lot of it. I've never met a man who was completely obsessed with guns that wasn't horrifically insecure about his masculinity. It's kind of comparable to homophobia, I think, in that respect, where it often stems from insecurity about one's own sexuality. The whole "thou dost protesteth too much," I think, plays a big role in that. Gertrude from Hamlet, I think that was the play Hamlet, where Gertrude said that. So I think there's a little bit of that. And there's also a misconception about what it is to be a patrioit and what patriotism is.
You have just pissed off a lot of people once again. And
I think it's important to understand are some so obsessed with the Second Amendment? Why do they want to keep it relevant and pretend that it is something that it's clearly not? Well, I mean, the founders would be utterly flabbergasted if they saw the NRA today. They would be like, what in heaven's name are you doing? What are you talking about? They would also look at the Pentagon with its $1 trillion annual budget and also pull their hair out and say, what on earth is happening?
It's the belief system of the average American. Is nobody has disabused anyone of thinking differently about the Second Amendment. And they just believe that that's what it really is. You point out in your article, Mason Scott, masonscott.org, you can read The Obsolescence of the Second Amendment. You point out that we're told here that the problem is we don't have enough guns. That's why everyone is getting shot. If we were all armed, nobody would get shot because we'd all be armed. Yet places where people are unarmed, using that logic, you point out, using that logic, there should be so much death because they're not armed, like Norway or England, where there ain't none. But
the entire planet is a glaring counterfactual to the claim that the more guns that exist in a society, the safer everyone is. It's preposterous it defies common sense. But again, this is what the gun lobby really wants people to believe. They invoke that yearning to be, again, the gun-toting, swaggering cowboy you see in the movies. I think a lot of boys have that even into adulthood, and this appeals to that kind of psychological mechanism. But they want you to believe that the more access there is to guns, the safer everyone's going to be, which is the exact opposite of the case. And we don't have to speculate about that. We can just survey the entire planet Earth and see that the societies where there are the least guns amongst the citizenry, amongst regular everyday people, the less death occurs from guns.
It reminds me of the logic of Dick Cheney. If anybody remembers historically, something called the Bush administration after 9/11, the Patriot Act and such. And there was an issue with the dreaded pine beetle. And the dreaded pine beetle, which is a real beetle, it likes to eat the wood of pine trees and it'll kill them. So there was a significant amount of pine beetle infestation. So the answer was to cut down all the pines everywhere. And of course, Halliburton, being Dick Cheney's former company, would be very happy to log them and turn them into people's decks in their houses. So the official thing was, we must cut down all the trees to save them. Yes, we must cut down all the trees to save them from the pine beetle. And it's the same kind of thinking. We must arm everyone to the teeth in order to keep them from getting shot, except that we know exactly how it turns out. And that's why this is extraordinary. So let's end with this. What is the solution? We have an obsolete amendment, which is not going to go away. Other amendments aren't going to go away because we like them or don't like them. This one is here to stay. But people have an understanding of it that has nothing to do with the founding daddies, with their invention. It's been reconfigured, rebranded, and resold and remarketed, and people are clueless. So what's the answer? Is there one?
I think part of it is what we're doing now, generating awareness. I think that's step number one, getting the word out, helping people to understand. I think that it's also important to understand that individual liberty, which is very important, does not depend on being able to kill other people. One's power to use lethal force against other humans, even thieves, robbers, assailants, does not make the public square safer, and it doesn't make the individual more free. So freedom does not depend on being able to arm yourself with lethal firepower. And I think that's a big misconception. The other concern is hunting is a huge part of Americana, and we need to respect that. And I think it's important to understand that by saying that the Second Amendment is obsolete, it doesn't follow that there should be no guns, period, ever. It just means that there very well are possible arguments to own guns of different sorts under certain circumstances. It's just that those arguments need to be made based on another basis, not based on this amendment that had nothing to do with hunting or being able to kill intruders if they break into your house to rob you of something. And that hunters especially, I know some that make their whole livelihood is hunting, need to understand that this is not, it doesn't follow from recognizing the obsolescence of the Second Amendment that guns will be outlawed across the board. And I think if you can dispel that fear, I think people will be more open to, more receptive to hearing about the actual history of this amendment. And then we can proceed with formulating the best conditions under which any given person can arm themselves with a lethal firearm if it's warranted. And that's a discussion that I think is important to have, and we can have it. But the Second Amendment, completely irrelevant.
So just to end, I'm thinking of these militia groups, of which we saw many that have a shaman, the QAnon shaman, who we've all seen now with the horns and the animal skins and the rest of it, who knows about all the lizard people that occupy the federal government, along with the child pornography rings and all the other things that they believe is happening. These militia groups would in many ways be, I guess, by the founding fathers' notion, illegal, because they're not serving the state. They're at the self-serve pump, which was not the idea. So having bunches of militias pop up, what would be the word for extra state, extra statutory? I mean, that's kind of not constitutionally legal, I wouldn't think. Maybe it's not illegal, but.
Well, here's the counterintuitive thing. They could put forth an argument that says they have the right to arm themselves as some kind of private militia. You could entertain that hypothetical argument. The catch is it would have to have nothing to do with the Second Amendment. It would have to be based on something else. So if someone wants to say, I want a private militia and we're going to arm ourselves because we think that all white men with Scandinavian descent that are over 5'10" should be able to blah, 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 blah. You know, any kind of cockamamie outlandish thing hypothetical you could come up with. Okay, fine. Let's hear this. It's a nutty argument, but the fact of the matter is it has nothing to do with the Second Amendment either way, because the Second Amendment had absolutely nothing to do with that. So, make the argument. Let's hear it and let's, dispel it. So something like that would be dispelled for 1,000 other reasons. The racism, of course, being the most obvious, but public safety, who should be allowed to carry weapons. This is all an important discussion, but it has nothing to do with what was written in the late 1780s by a group of men who were concerned about putting down insurgencies for lack of a standing army at the time. It just has nothing to do with it.
Right.
So,
Indians and black people, nothing much has changed.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mason Scott. You can read the entire article, and you can even download it as a PDF.
You can download it as a PDF. It comes out to about 36, 37 pages. Most of the essays on the site are roughly that length, all the way up to about 100 pages. You can download the PDFs of any of them. I think the next essay I wrote was about misconceptions about the founding of the United States as a Christian nation. I dispelled that myth as well. I think you have to scroll down maybe like 25 or 30 essays from the top. They're in order of how recently they were published. So, you got to do a little scrolling down, maybe about 25 or 30 before you get to it, but it's down there, maybe on the third or fourth page, cause I wrote it a couple years ago. And, yeah, I'd love to hear feedback too. If there's anything I'm missing, I'm always up to learn something new.
We'll delve into actually the myth of being a Christian nation, and I'll share with you during that time one of my ancestors, Mr. Benedict Arnold, and what actually happened there, because it's fascinating, along with a couple of framers of the Constitution that I'm related to, and the rest of it, and the family diaries that I have, and what they say about all of this. So
that would be great to hear. I'd love to hear that.
We'll have you back on. We'll schedule another one. Thank you so much, Mason Scott. MasonScott.org. Cary.
Harrison's Reality Check.
Imagine this is your money and someone wants to take it from you. Who is it? The IRS. Guess what? They want your money and they can take it, all of it if they want. Remember, they sent you that letter right over here that said, hey, you owe us a bunch of cash and we're going to take it from you right now. So what do? You fight back by letting our team of experts work it out with the IRS so you can keep your money. And hey, we're good at what we do. When you hire us, you get a team of guys on your side that know the IRS laws, and we'll fight really hard to save your money. So, if you owe the IRS a ton of cash and you want to keep it, call right now and learn for free how we can help you put it back in your pocket. 5 minutes of your time right now can save you thousands of dollars. And the best part, it's a free call, so please call right now.